Picture this. You're invited to the most exclusive palace in Europe. Golden chandeliers, priceless artwork, servants waiting on your every need. You're about to meet actual royalty, the most powerful, wealthy people in the world. You bow gracefully as the queen enters the room, expecting elegance and perfection. Instead, you're hit with a smell so overwhelming, so absolutely revolting, that you struggle not to gag right there in front of Her Majesty. Welcome to the real world of historical royalty, where the stench was so bad that entire courts had to carry around pomanders, little balls stuffed with herbs and spices, just to breathe without vomiting. Where kings and queens went months, sometimes years, without a proper bath. Where lice were so common in royal hair that they had special combs made of gold and ivory, just to pick them out during court meetings. You think modern celebrities have weird habits? Wait until you hear about Queen Isabella of Spain, who allegedly bragged about taking only 2 baths in her entire life. One when she was born, and one on her wedding day. Or King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, who was so afraid of water that he substituted baths with rubbing himself down with spirits and changing his shirt. That's it. That was his idea of staying clean. But here's the thing that'll really blow your mind. This wasn't considered gross back then. This was normal. This was how the most powerful, educated, wealthy people in the world lived. And there are reasons for it that are actually more shocking than the smell itself. See, our ancestors weren't just lazy about hygiene, they were actually terrified of it. Medieval doctors genuinely believed that water could kill you. They thought that bathing opened up your pores and let in disease and evil spirits. Hot water was considered especially dangerous because it would supposedly make your body too weak to fight off illness. Cold water? Even worse, it could literally shock you to death. So instead of washing with water, royalty developed the most bizarre cleaning rituals you can imagine. They would rub themselves with linen cloths to remove dirt. They'd pack their clothes with herbs and flowers, thinking the smell would somehow transfer cleanliness to their bodies. They believed that changing your undergarments was basically the same as bathing. Some queens would literally just pile on more and more perfume until the smell was so strong it could knock you unconscious. And the teeth? Oh man, don't even get me started on royal teeth. Sugar was a luxury item that only the wealthy could afford, so naturally, royalty consumed it by the pound. Queen Elizabeth Reifens. Or's teeth were so black and rotten that foreign ambassadors wrote home in horror about her smile. She tried to fix this by stuffing cloth into the gaps where her teeth used to be. Imagine trying to have a diplomatic conversation with someone who's basically got rags hanging out of their mouth. The crazy part is that being dirty was actually a status symbol. The dirtier you were, the more it proved you didn't have to do manual labor. Clean hands meant you were probably a peasant who had to wash for work. Stained, perfumed, and absolutely filthy hands meant you were too important to touch anything dirty. But there's one queen whose hygiene habits were so legendary, so absolutely mind-blowing, that she makes all the others look like neat freaks. A queen who turned avoiding baths into an art form, who made being dirty a political statement, and whose body odor was so famous that it influenced international relations. Throughout this video, we're going to dive deep into the most disgusting, shocking, and downright unbelievable hygiene practices of history's most powerful rulers. We'll explore how these habits affected their health, their relationships, and even the course of history itself. You'll learn why some kings wore the same underwear for months, why queens thought lice were a sign of good health, and how the simple act of taking a bath could literally get you accused of being in league with the devil. Trust me, by the end of this, you're going to look at every historical drama differently. All those beautiful, pristine castles and elegant court scenes. Pure fantasy. The reality was so much stranger, so much more disgusting, and honestly, so much more fascinating than anything Hollywood has ever shown us. So buckle up, because we're about to take a journey through the stinkiest, most revolting courts in history. And fair warning, you might want to take a shower after watching this, just to remind yourself how good we have it today. Let's start our journey in medieval Europe, where being clean was not just unfashionable, it was downright dangerous to your reputation and possibly your life. You see, the medieval mind had this twisted logic about cleanliness that would make absolutely no sense to us today. First off, they believed that dirt was literally a protective layer. Think of it like medieval sunscreen, except instead of blocking UV rays, your accumulated grime was supposedly blocking diseases, evil spirits, and bad luck. The thicker your layer of dirt, the safer you were. Some monks took this so seriously that they took vows never to wash, believing that their holy filth would bring them closer to God. Saint Agnes supposedly never washed her feet her entire life. Saint Abraham went 50 years without washing his hands or feet, and was celebrated for it. These weren't just random crazy people. These were revered holy figures whose habits influenced how everyone, including royalty, thought about cleanliness. But the real kicker: water itself was considered evil in many circles. Not just potentially harmful, actually evil. Medieval Christians associated bathing with paganism because Romans had loved their baths. Anything the Romans did was automatically suspect, and since the Romans had elaborate bathing rituals, obviously bathing was somehow connected to worshipping false gods. Public bathhouses, which had been common during Roman times, became associated with sin and debauchery. By the medieval period, if you were caught frequenting a bathhouse, people assumed you were up to no good. The church actively discouraged bathing, preaching that too much attention to bodily cleanliness was vanity and pride, 2 of the 7 deadly sins. So, what did medieval royalty do instead of bathing? They developed the most elaborate and weird cleaning rituals you can imagine. The wealthy would employ servants whose entire job was to rub them down with expensive cloths soaked in wine or vinegar. They believed that the alcohol would somehow sanitize their skin without the dangerous effects of water. King John of England had an obsession with washing his hands, but only his hands, and only before meals. He would go through this elaborate ritual where servants would pour wine over his hands while he rubbed them with silk cloths, but the rest of his body completely ignored. He reportedly went years without bathing his body, while being absolutely paranoid about his hand cleanliness. The clothing situation was even worse. Medieval royalty believed that linen had magical cleaning properties. They thought that if you wore clean linen next to your skin, it would somehow absorb all the dirt and sweat from your body, leaving you clean. So instead of washing themselves, they would just change their shirts. But here's where it gets really gross. They didn't change these shirts daily, or even weekly. King Edward II of England was known to wear the same linen shirt for months at a time. By the time it was changed, servants had to literally peel it off his body, because it had become stuck to his skin with sweat, dirt, and God knows what else. The smell situation was handled with what they called dry cleaning. This involved stuffing their clothes with herbs, flowers, and spices. Lavender, rosemary, sage. Anything that smelled strong enough to mask body odor. Some royalty would sleep with sachets of herbs in their beds, thinking that breathing in the scent all night would somehow make their bodies smell better. Queen Blanche of Castile took this to an extreme level. She would have her servants burn incense in every room before she entered, and she wore so many herb sachets sewn into her clothing that she rustled like a walking garden when she moved. Contemporary accounts describe her as smelling like a walking apothecary shop, which sounds nice until you realize what they were trying to cover up. But the teeth and mouth situation, absolutely horrifying. Medieval royalty had no concept of dental hygiene. They believed that cleaning your teeth too much would make them fall out faster. Instead, they would rinse their mouths with wine or honey, thinking the sweetness would somehow make their breath better. Obviously, this just rotted their teeth faster. King Philip IV of France was famous for having breath so bad that people would faint during audiences with him. His solution? He started chewing on herbs constantly, but not cleaning herbs. He chewed on whatever tasted strong. Garlic, onions, bitter roots. Imagine trying to conduct royal business with someone whose breath smelled like a combination of rotting teeth and raw garlic. The really insane part is that all of this was documented and celebrated. Court chroniclers would write admiringly about how a particular king or queen had gone months without succumbing to the weakness of bathing. It was seen as a sign of strength, willpower, and spiritual purity. This wasn't ignorance. This was a completely different worldview about what cleanliness meant and how the human body worked. Now let's talk about the queen who made avoiding baths legendary. Queen Isabella Bon of Castile. This woman didn't just avoid bathing. She turned it into a political and religious statement that influenced European royalty for generations. Isabella famously declared that she had only bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding to Ferdinand of Aragon. But here's the really wild part. She said this with pride. She wasn't embarrassed or apologetic about it. In her mind, this made her more pure, more holy, and more worthy of ruling than any monarch who indulged in the weakness of regular washing. But Isabella's hygiene habits went way beyond just avoiding baths. She believed that any form of bodily maintenance was vanity. She refused to change her clothes during important military campaigns, thinking that keeping the same garments would bring divine favor to her armies. During the siege of Granada, which lasted months, she wore the same white dress the entire time. By the end, it was apparently so stained and filthy that it had turned completely brown. The really crazy thing? This started a fashion trend. Other Spanish noblewomen began copying Isabella's habits, thinking that dirtiness would make them more pious and respected. They would brag about how long they had gone without changing clothes or washing their hair. Some would compete to see who could go the longest without bathing. But Isabella wasn't the only royal with shocking hygiene habits. Let's talk about King Louis XV of France, who took the fear of water to absolutely insane levels. This guy was so terrified of bathing that he wouldn't even let water touch his skin for medical reasons. When he got sick, which happened frequently, doctors had to treat him by rubbing medicines directly onto his clothes, hoping it would somehow absorb through the fabric. Louis XV also had this bizarre obsession with his hat. He wore the same felt hat every single day for years, never taking it off except to sleep. Servants reported that when the hat was finally removed, his scalp was covered in sores and his hair had partially rotted away from the constant moisture and lack of air. But he refused to get a new hat because he believed this particular one brought him luck in battles. Then there's King Henry IV of France, whose hygiene habits were so legendary that they affected international diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors would literally request meetings be held outdoors because the smell in enclosed spaces was unbearable. Henry's body odor was so strong that people could smell him coming from rooms away. But Henry didn't see this as a problem. He saw it as a sign of his masculinity and strength. He believed that strong men naturally had strong smells, and that trying to mask or reduce your natural odor was effeminate and weak. He would joke that his enemies could track him by scent alone, and he considered this an advantage because it meant they would be so intimidated by his presence that they couldn't think clearly. The Habsburg dynasty takes royal filth to another level entirely. Emperor Rudolph II was known for never washing his hands, believing that the accumulated dirt contained magical properties that helped him make better decisions. He would examine his fingernails during important meetings, claiming he could read omens in the patterns of dirt and grime. His cousin, Archduke Ferdinand, had an even stranger habit. He collected his own dead skin. Whenever he scratched himself, he would save the skin flakes in small pouches, thinking they could be used for magical rituals or medicine. He had an entire room in his palace dedicated to storing these pouches, organized by date and body part. But perhaps the most shocking royal hygiene story belongs to King Christian VII of Denmark. This guy had a phobia of clean clothes. He believed that washing fabric removed its life force, and that wearing freshly cleaned clothes would drain his energy. So he would wear the same outfit until it literally fell apart on his body. When his clothes finally disintegrated, he wouldn't put on new ones immediately. Instead, he would have servants bring him clothes that had been worn by other people for weeks or months first. He thought that clothes needed to be seasoned with human sweat and oils before they were safe to wear. The smell in Christian's court was reportedly so bad that visiting dignitaries would fake illnesses to avoid attending royal functions. Some ambassadors started bringing their own incense burners to meetings, which was considered incredibly rude, but was apparently the only way they could function in the same room as the king. What's really mind-blowing is that none of these monarchs were considered crazy or unusual by their contemporaries. These habits were seen as eccentric, maybe, but not abnormal. In fact, many of them were admired for their spiritual strength in resisting the temptations of bodily comfort. Since actual bathing was out of the question, European royalty became absolutely obsessed with masking their natural aromas through increasingly elaborate and expensive methods. What they created was essentially a medieval arms race of scent warfare, where the goal wasn't to be clean, but to smell so artificially strong that your natural odors couldn't break through. Let's start with King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who turned avoiding water into an art form. Louis was genuinely terrified of bathing, not just uncomfortable with it, but actually phobic. He believed that water would weaken his constitution and make him vulnerable to disease. But since he was the most powerful man in Europe, he couldn't just smell terrible all the time. His solution was revolutionary and absolutely bonkers. Louis invented what he called dry bathing. Every morning, his servants would rub him down with spirits, basically alcohol, mixed with crushed herbs and flower petals. They would literally marinate him in this mixture, scrubbing his entire body with silk cloths soaked in perfumed spirits. The process took over an hour and used ingredients that cost more than most people's annual income. But that was just the beginning. Louis would then have different perfumes applied to different parts of his body. Orange blossom water on his face, rose oil on his hands, lavender essence on his chest, and musk, which comes from deer glands, by the way, on his lower body. He used so much perfume that people could smell him from 3 rooms away, and visitors to Versailles reported that the scent was so overwhelming it would give them headaches. The really crazy part? This became the standard for European royalty. Everyone started copying Louis XIV's dry bathing routine, but they all tried to outdo each other with increasingly expensive and exotic ingredients. Catherine de' Medici, when she was Queen of France, imported perfume makers from Italy and basically created the French perfume industry just to deal with royal hygiene needs. She had perfumes made from ingredients that sound like a witch's potion: ambergris from whale intestines, civet musk from cat glands, castoreum from beaver anal sacs. Yeah, you heard that right? Royalty was literally rubbing themselves with animal secretions from the most uncomfortable places you can imagine. But Catherine took it even further. She believed that certain scents had magical properties, so she would change her perfume combination based on what she wanted to accomplish that day. Meeting with foreign ambassadors? She'd use intimidating scents like dragon's blood resin and black pepper oil. Trying to seduce her husband, she'd go with supposedly aphrodisiac combinations involving jasmine, vanilla, and something called essence of nightshade that was probably literally poisonous. Queen Elizabeth I of England developed her own signature scent routine that was so complex it required a dedicated team of servants to execute. She would start with a base layer of rosewater and honey, then add what she called her Majesty mixture, a combination of frankincense, myrrh, and crushed pearls mixed with wine. Yes, crushed pearls. She was literally rubbing gemstones into her skin as a form of hygiene. But Elizabeth's signature ingredient was something called unicorn horn powder, which was actually ground narwhal tusk imported at enormous expense from Arctic traders. She believed this would give her a mystical, otherworldly scent that would make people more likely to obey her commands. The smell was reportedly so strong and strange that some people thought she actually was magical. The whole perfume situation got completely out of hand during the reign of King Henry III of France. This guy was so obsessed with scent that he would change his perfume combination multiple times per day. He had different perfumes for morning, afternoon, evening, and late night. He had special perfumes for eating, for court functions, for military meetings, and for religious services. Henry III's perfume collection included over 200 different bottles, and he employed a full-time perfumer whose only job was to create new scent combinations. Some of his perfumes were so strong that they would stain his clothes and leave marks on furniture where he sat. People complained that rooms would smell like Henry for days after he visited. The economics of this perfume obsession were insane. King Charles II of England spent more money on perfumes and scented oils than he did on his entire navy. Queen Anne of Austria's annual perfume budget was larger than the construction costs for several major palaces. But here's the really wild part. Despite all these elaborate perfume rituals, everyone still smelled terrible. The perfumes didn't actually clean anything. They just created these bizarre scent combinations where you'd smell expensive flowers mixed with human body odor, creating what one contemporary writer described as the scent of a garden built on a graveyard. Foreign visitors to European courts consistently wrote home about the overwhelming and contradictory smells. Expensive perfumes mixed with unwashed bodies, creating combinations that were somehow worse than either smell alone. Now, let's get into the really gross stuff. The actual health consequences of these hygiene habits. Because while royal courts were busy convincing themselves that dirt was healthy and water was dangerous, their bodies were paying a terrible price that was impossible to ignore, even with all the perfume in the world. Let's start with the lice situation, because this is where things get absolutely horrifying. Lice weren't just common in royal courts. They were literally everywhere. In hair, in clothes, in bedding, crawling around openly during court functions. But here's the kicker. Many royals actually thought lice were a good sign. They believed that lice only lived on healthy people, so having lice meant your body was strong and vibrant. King Ferdinand of Spain had such a severe lice infestation that court observers could see them crawling around in his hair during public audiences. But instead of being embarrassed, Ferdinand would proudly point them out to visitors, explaining that the number of lice you had was directly related to your royal blood. The more royal you were, the more lice you'd attract. Queen Christina of Sweden took this to an extreme level. She believed that different types of lice indicated different aspects of good health. She would examine the lice in her hair and clothes every morning, using their size and color to make decisions about her daily activities. Big fat lice meant she was in peak physical condition and should handle important state business. Smaller lice meant she should rest and focus on spiritual matters. But the lice weren't just gross. They were spreading disease. Typhus, which is transmitted by body lice, was rampant in royal courts. Kings and queens were constantly getting sick with mysterious fevers and rashes that modern doctors recognize as lice-borne illnesses. But medieval physicians had no idea about the connection, so they kept recommending treatments that made the lice problem worse. The standard medical treatment for fever was to avoid washing and to wear heavy, warm clothes to sweat out the illness. This created perfect breeding conditions for lice, which multiplied rapidly in the warm, moist environment of unwashed royal bodies wrapped in thick fabrics. King Henry IV of England died from what was likely typhus transmitted by his own body lice. In his final weeks, courtiers reported that he was covered in so many lice that his clothes appeared to be moving on their own. But his doctors kept piling more blankets on him and forbidding any washing, thinking they were helping him recover. The skin conditions were equally horrifying. Without proper washing, royal skin would develop these layers of built-up oils, dead skin, and dirt that created perfect environments for bacterial infections. King Louis XIV had recurring boils and abscesses that would burst during court functions, soaking through his clothes and creating stains that servants couldn't remove. But Louis's doctors had convinced him that these infections were actually his body purging evil humors, so he wasn't allowed to clean the wounds properly. Instead, they would just pile more perfumed powders on top of the infected areas, creating these crusty scented scabs that would crack and bleed. Queen Anne of England suffered from what was probably severe eczema made worse by never washing. Her skin would crack and bleed, then get infected because of the constant layer of dirt and perfume. She would scratch herself until she bled, then refuse to clean the wounds because she believed that washing would make the infection spread. The dental situation was equally nightmarish. Without any concept of oral hygiene, royal teeth would rot away completely. But the high-sugar diet that only royalty could afford made it even worse. King Louis XIII had most of his teeth removed by age 40, but the extractions were done without anesthesia and often became severely infected. Queen Elizabeth II's tooth decay was so advanced that abscesses in her jaw would rupture during public speeches, filling her mouth with pus that she would have to swallow or spit discreetly into handkerchiefs. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about the Queen's dental health because it affected her ability to speak clearly during diplomatic negotiations. But perhaps the most shocking health consequence was the impact on royal pregnancies and childbirth. Queen Isabella of Spain's refusal to bathe during pregnancy was typical for royal women, who believed that water could harm unborn children. The lack of hygiene led to frequent infections that we now know increase the risk of miscarriage and maternal death. Many royal women would go through entire pregnancies without washing, then give birth in beds that hadn't been cleaned in months. The infection rates were astronomical, but medieval medicine attributed the deaths to weak constitutions, or divine displeasure rather than the obvious hygiene issues. King Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, was probably affected by generations of poor hygiene practices. His numerous health problems, including his inability to chew food properly due to his deformed jaw, were likely worsened by the infections and diseases that ran rampant in his perpetually filthy court. The really tragic part is that some royals began to realize that their hygiene habits were making them sick, but the social and religious pressure to avoid bathing was so strong that they couldn't change their behavior without appearing weak or impious. So how did we get from lice-infested, perfume-soaked monarchs to the relatively clean royalty we know today? The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it took some pretty dramatic events to convince European royalty that maybe, just maybe, water wasn't the enemy they thought it was. The turning point came in the 18th century, and ironically, it started with another French king, Louis XV. Unlike his predecessor Louis XIV, who was terrified of water, Louis XV became fascinated with bathing after a series of health scares that nearly killed him. When he was 35, he developed what was probably a severe case of typhus. Remember, that's the lice-borne disease that had been plaguing royal courts for centuries. Louis XV's illness was so severe that he was given last rites 3 times. During his recovery, a progressive doctor named François Quesnay suggested something revolutionary. Maybe the king should try washing regularly to prevent reinfection. Quesnay had been studying reports from Ottoman Turkey, where regular bathing was common and disease rates were lower. The idea was considered absolutely radical, but Louis XV was desperate. He secretly began taking warm baths infused with medicinal herbs. Within months, his health improved dramatically. His skin cleared up, his chronic headaches disappeared, and most importantly, he stopped getting the recurring fevers that had plagued him for years. But Louis XV couldn't just announce that he was bathing regularly. That would have been political suicide. Instead, he started what he called therapeutic water treatments, prescribed by his doctor. He built elaborate private bath chambers in Versailles and began promoting the idea that water could be medicinal if used properly and under medical supervision. The real game changer came when Marie Antoinette arrived at the French court. As an Austrian princess, she came from a culture that was already moving toward better hygiene practices. Marie Antoinette was shocked by the smell and filth of Versailles and basically forced a hygiene revolution through sheer willpower and royal privilege. Marie Antoinette didn't just bathe regularly, she made it fashionable. She turned bathing into an elaborate social ritual, complete with special soaps, oils, and perfumes that were meant to enhance cleanliness rather than mask filth. She had a custom bathtub made from marble and spent hours each day in elaborate bathing ceremonies that became the talk of European courts. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: military necessity. During the 7 Years' War, military commanders began noticing that troops who had access to washing facilities stayed healthier and fought more effectively than those who did not. Army doctors started requiring soldiers to wash regularly and documented dramatic improvements in health and morale. These military reports reached royal courts across Europe and provided the scientific evidence that hygiene advocates needed. Suddenly, cleanliness wasn't just a personal choice. It was a matter of national security. Kings who wanted effective armies needed healthy soldiers, and healthy soldiers needed to be clean. King George III of England became one of the first monarchs to publicly embrace regular bathing. He installed modern plumbing in Buckingham Palace and made cleanliness a requirement for anyone attending court functions. Foreign diplomats reported that the English court suddenly smelled completely different, actually pleasant for the first time in centuries. The transformation accelerated during the Victorian era, when Queen Victoria turned cleanliness into a moral imperative. Victoria believed that personal hygiene reflected moral character, and she made regular bathing a requirement for anyone in her service. She famously said that cleanliness is next to godliness, completely reversing centuries of religious opposition to washing. But the change wasn't immediate or universal. As late as the 1800s, some European royals were still resisting the bathing revolution. King Ferdinand VII of Spain continued his family's tradition of avoiding water, and the Spanish court remained notoriously smelly well into the 19th century. The final nail in the coffin of royal filth came with the development of germ theory in the mid-1800s, when scientists like Louis Pasteur proved that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms that could be killed by soap and water. The medical argument for cleanliness became undeniable. Suddenly, all those centuries of royal sickness and death made perfect sense. The typhus epidemics, the skin infections, the dental abscesses, the high rates of death in childbirth. It was all connected to the deliberate avoidance of basic hygiene. Modern royalty like Queen Elizabeth II represents the complete opposite of their historical predecessors. Today's royal families are known for their impeccable grooming and cleanliness, with teams of stylists and health professionals ensuring they always look and smell perfect. It's almost impossible to imagine now, but the transformation from the lice-infested courts of medieval Europe to the pristine royal families of today represents one of the most dramatic cultural shifts in human history. We went from considering dirt holy to considering cleanliness essential, and it only took about 300 years and countless royal deaths to figure it out. The next time you see a perfectly groomed royal on television, remember that their ancestors would have been absolutely horrified by all that cleanliness, and probably would have predicted that so much washing would kill them instantly.